Hi everybody, I'm Piers Taylor. I've convened this discussion tonight around the 1-year anniversary of Architects Declare. And this came out of being emailed by Peter Clegg, who's one of the speakers, to ask, well, he asked us to help feed into what AD had achieved 1 year on. And I think my initial response was that Zaha Hadid Architects had belittled the declaration by carrying on in a business as usual manner. But in some ways, I guess it was foolish of me to think that AD should police declaration and pledges. And Clara is going to talk a little bit about this. But it did make me think, where are we now? Where are we going? And how do we get there? And of course, this is in part a political question, which is why we need someone like Gwen as part of this discussion. One other reason that this debate is super topical and timely is because of COVID. And we declared a climate emergency just over a year ago, and nothing changed. I mean, what was interesting is that nothing changed because we declared a climate emergency. But when COVID hit, everything changed. And the question has to be, what type of emergency do we need to declare to see CO2 emissions drop? And the answer, in a way, is the COVID type emergency, where we saw emissions drop overnight by about a third. So it's extraordinary to see just how much we can change if we want to, which shows us in some ways it's a matter of choice, individual choice and political choice. But the question for us here and now is, what can architects do? What should we do? What should we lead on? What should we do that goes beyond what our appointment and fee suggests that we have to do? What pressures should be put on policymakers and how? And why is it so hard to make genuinely zero carbon buildings, let alone carbon positive or regenerative design? And what can we do with density? Stuart Brand, of course, called the city the greatest contribution to sustainability of all time. And with COVID issues, our worry, I guess, is that people will resist moving to the city, which in turn means they consume less, consume fewer resources, have fewer children, free up land use for other uses rather than subsistence farming and intensive agriculture. So with this, what are our timescales when we know at the very least we have a relatively short amount of time to follow through with a coordinated global plan to reduce CO2 and restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So now each speaker will introduce themselves in turn, and then they'll talk around some of these themes, beginning now with Peter Clegg. Peter, you probably have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute, Peter.
It's amazing how difficult it is to remember that. Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction, Piers, and great to be talking to people. My name is Peter Clegg. I'm a founding partner of Field & Clegg Bradley Studios. We set up the practice now 42 years ago with a view to creating an architecture that was based on a consideration of social and environmental issues. And we've been lucky enough to have amazing clients over the years, to work for Greenpeace, headquarters for Greenpeace, headquarters for National Trust, the Woodland Trust, BRE, etc. And we've been very lucky to be given those opportunities to push the boundaries of low carbon architecture. The sad thing is that we have failed to make a paradigm shift in the way we regard the problem of the climate crisis. And I think what's happened recently with both the climate emergency declarations on the back of the Paris Climate Agreement and the Biodiversity Crisis Declaration, as well as Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, etc. What's happened recently is that there is a new sense of kind of desperation around how we achieve how we stay below carbon dioxide emissions that will result in less than 1.5 degrees of global warming. And what happened just a bit more than a year ago now was that Steve Tompkins got in touch with me, having discussed this issue with Michael Paulin, and said, what can we do to actually bring this to greater public awareness amongst the profession? And we decided to get together a group of Stirling Prize winning architects. It seemed like a good way to get some publicity into it, into the declaration. We sat down with them, we produced an 11-point declaration, which we were anticipating might get a few hundred other signatories to sign up to it. And we're now up to, I think, 963 when I checked today. But not only that, we have we've also spawned engineers declare, civil engineers declare, environmental engineers declare, the architectural education declaration, and the landscape architects declare. And we've got now more than 5,000 signatories in 23 countries that have come up with similar declarations tailored to their own situation. But it is an extraordinary sort of global movement. Now, Clara Bagnall-George is going to talk more about AD and where we're going with it. And also Letty, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, which she heads up. And we'll come back and discuss some of the things that are most concerning to us in terms of both the declaration and the movement towards zero carbon architecture. So I guess I'll hand over, I was going to hand over now to Gwen, I think, was it? No, to Clara.
Clara.
Clara, right.
Just before Clara introduces herself, can I also say to everyone that's listening that I'd like very much that you all feed into this. So if there are key questions during this that you'd like to ask members of the panel, specifically about AD and what else they should and could be doing, can you raise it in the chat? And at the end, we'll unmute you and you can speak and ask these questions. Clara.
Thanks, Piers. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great, wonderful. Thank you. So I'm Clara Bagnall-George. I'm an associate at Elementa Consulting. So I'm an engineer. We're a deep green MEP consultancy. I sit across mechanical and sustainability teams, which really helps me try and integrate sustainability and reducing carbon emissions into the projects that I work in. I guess I'm here because I care about climate change, and I care about climate change because I really care about people. So that's my driver, and that's the reason why I took a career in the built environment. This is where I felt like I could have the biggest impact in mitigating climate change. So 3 years ago, I set up LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, which is a voluntary group of built environment professionals. I've seen a few names here of people who have been involved for a long time, so it's nice to see familiar faces and names. And so we are a movement that is trying to move the UK's buildings to zero carbon. First, we were frustrated because policy wasn't moving fast enough in the right direction, and so we did some work on that, and then we've been focusing on defining good and publishing guidance on what buildings need to look like to meet our climate change targets. So at the beginning of this year, I was invited to join the Architects Declare steering group, and I think that's because we really feel that Architects Declare and LETI really work well together. They kind of take slightly different angle and approaches, but they're really in sync, and we want to make sure that that collaboration continues. So for me, the important things are collaboration, sharing knowledge, and meeting the quantifiable targets we need to meet the climate emergency. I'm going to hand over to Gwen.
Thanks, Clara. Hi, everyone. My name is Gwen Buck, and I'm a policy advisor at the environmental think tank Green Alliance. So thanks so much, Piers, for inviting me along today. And I'm just going to share a little presentation, basically just to sort of set the scene for Clara and Peter, just in terms of where we are sort of politically and in terms of carbon emissions in the UK. So I'll just try and share my screen now. Hopefully it will happen easily. Great, so hopefully you can all see that, and it's all in the regular format for you. Any problems, just give me a wave.
Can still see your speaker note. Right?
Oh, okay, thank you. Let me just try that again.
Yeah, that's working.
Great. Let me just...
Oh, it's come back now.
Oh no, this didn't happen in the practice. Okay, well, I'll try and do it just regularly, and that should be fine. So yeah, just to set the scene, we've got a legally binding net zero goal for 2050, and I'm sure you'll all know that, and will have been doing a lot of lobbying, and you know, this came about because of the Paris Agreement and the IPCC report, showing how devastating a 1.5 degree world would be, and the fact that we really do need to like limit those emissions. So last year we saw the Climate Change Act being amended, and that put this legally binding target into law, and that was introduced by Theresa May, remember her. And so underneath that target, we need to see loads of policies across the board for each sector. Obviously, we saw a huge amount of grassroots activism last year as well. I know Peter's already mentioned Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, and I think we just saw an amazing wave of activism coming up from the grassroots and really impacting those at the top. So in terms of where we are emissions-wise, I just thought it would be useful to include a couple of graphs from the Committee on Climate Change, and they're the government's official advisors on climate. And so if you can see that graph on the left, you'll see that the power sector has massively decarbonised since the 90s. And that's actually a huge kudos to the policy being put in place to get those emissions down. But that's mainly just because of coal phase out from the power sector. And unfortunately, we've seen pretty much every other sector stay pretty stagnant. So I'm guessing the main one that you're going to be interested in is that little slightly wiggly orange line in the middle, which is buildings. And that has remained pretty flat. So there's clearly some huge areas that need the policies put in place to get down to net zero by 2050. And I know a lot of you will also be thinking about 2050 and that kind of target and that date. And I know that that's been something that's been in the news quite a lot and attracted quite a lot of profile, is the date of 2050. And I think what's, you know, I think it's really important to think about that and to think about the date, but we've also got to think about how we get there. And it's worth noting that the government isn't even on track to meet its own net zero goal by 2050. So if it can't do that, I really think that it needs to get its act together to really put those policies in place to get us on track. And so at Green Alliance, we've done a bit of policy analysis and I guess a little bit of technical analysis to see where those carbon savings can be made. So again, I know Clara and Peter will talk about sort of buildings more specifically, but obviously this has got to be seen across the board and across all the different sectors. So we've been looking at bringing a ban in on petrol and diesel vehicles, so really pushing for electric vehicles there, a huge home energy efficiency program, so again on buildings and creating those really warm, efficient homes that people need. Better product design and reuse, and this is all about creating a circular economy. So how can we reuse the products that we've already got? How can we make sure that things are really truly being recycled? And that's quite an interesting policy because it also brings quite a lot of jobs to the UK and all across the UK as well, so not just concentrated in the south. And then also, again, the power sector, even though it's massively decarbonised, there's still a long way to go. So, you know, we need more onshore wind, we need more solar panels, and those are things that just need to be put in place. And, you know, it is a net zero goal, so we've got to think a bit about the net and net zero, and the fact that we also need to be restoring nature, because this is a nature crisis too. So, you know, really absorbing carbon from the atmosphere, getting those trees planted, getting the peatlands restored, and really doing all we can to make sure that our agriculture is sort of sustainable and absorbing as much carbon as possible. And, you know, as sort of Piers laid out right at the beginning, you know, we were in a climate crisis and now we're sort of in a triple crisis. We've got the climate crisis, which hasn't gone away. But we've also now got a health crisis and an economic crisis, both from coronavirus. So that's kind of where we are now. And I think, you know, the government is seeing this as, you know, I mean, it's unprecedented. So we've got these sort of triple whammy in the way. But you know, there are lots of people looking at this and thinking, well, you know, how can these be tackled together? So I mentioned the government's independent advisors on climate change, the Committee on Climate Change earlier, and they actually had their progress report out. So they do a sort of progress report to Parliament every year or so, and in that they sort of tell the government what they really need to be doing. And this one, they immediately turned it around to be all talking about the coronavirus. So it was, you know, how can you use this economic shock that we've had, this massive dip in the economy, to really boost the economy by creating green jobs, by putting the investment that we need into the environment, into tackling climate change, into creating those systems that we need for a net zero world. And so this was quite amazing to see from the government's own advisors, and you know, that chimes with a lot of what the NGOs are saying as well. So obviously myself and my colleagues, but across the board, you know, from Greenpeace to Friends of the Earth to the Woodland Trust and all those other people whose Peter has designed the offices for. And yeah, and I guess I just wanted to reflect a little bit on this and where it's actually going. So I know that a lot of people here will have obviously seen the news yesterday and seen a little bits of snippets of the summer statement. And I think what's amazing is that even though yesterday was, you know, it was a bit of a stopgap, it wasn't a long-term economic plan, it was a stopgap. But what we saw in there was hints of potentially things to come on, you know, putting that investment that really needs to go in there on, you know, to get towards net zero. And, you know, we saw a little bit of that. So we did see 2 billion for Green Homes grant. So just to put that into context, what the environmental charities were calling for was 1 billion a year until 2030. So obviously that's a little bit on the way, and it's really caveated with what kind. So what are we going to see in the autumn statement? What are we going to see in the comprehensive spending review? So I think these are all areas that we all can be pushing on, and really making sure that that is set and that is the voice that the government is hearing. Because I mean, there are so many benefits to this. You know, we know that a net zero world is not only good for sort of productivity and jobs, but also is great for people's health, great for people's well-being. You know, people have spent more time outside in their local parks, you know, thinking about their communities and walking and cycling more. So, you know, how are we going to, you know, make sure that these changes that have been in the short term good for the environment, how are we going to make sure that those are in the long term too? And yeah, so I guess I just thought I'd finish off with a little bit of you know, a little bit of reality. You know, this is a critical time for the government, and I think I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the sort of politics of the Conservative Party as well. So you know, they've got a majority in government at the moment, and a lot of the reason for that is from, you know, being able to tackle those so-called red wall constituencies, which are now, of course, a bit of a blue wall. But you know, people in those constituencies, I think it's really important to remember, like, you know, how are they going to be impacted by climate change? How can net zero solutions benefit those regions? You know, I was speaking to one of the Conservative MPs yesterday from Darlington, and he was saying how you know, there are a huge amount of jobs being created there now because of net zero, you know, because of offshore wind, that kind of thing. So like, you know, how can net zero benefit across the UK? And then it's easy to forget that obviously Brexit is happening as well, amongst all of this. And, you know, on the environment front, we've actually got a huge amount of important bills going through Parliament at the moment. So we've got the Agriculture Bill, the Environment Bill, Fisheries Bill, the Trade Bill, which will obviously have impacts on the environment. And these are all areas where the government is going to have to show where it wants to sit on the global stage. So we've really got you know, a government at a huge moment in history, figuring out its place in the global stage, whilst also being surrounded by all this kind of chaos and crisis. So how is it going to pull through? I mean it's anyone's game. And of course, this is a critical moment for climate leadership, as well as those other sort of more party political positionings. You know, we do have a net zero goal by 2050. How are the government going to get there? How are they going to put the policies in place? You know, this is a real challenge for all of us here. It's a challenge for myself and my colleagues in the environment sector, but it's also a challenge for, you know, for every other sector and everyone working really hard behind the scenes. You know, how can we make sure that the economic recovery from 2019 is positive? You know, it's been devastating and quite frankly, like, emotional for a lot of us. But, you know, how can we really pull together and make sure that the economic recovery from COVID-19 actually gets us on track? And yeah, I guess I also just thought I'd finish off with the fact that the UK is hosting COP26 in November 2021. It was delayed because of coronavirus. It was supposed to be this coming November. But again, this is a way that the UK is going to put itself on the global stage, and a lot of politicians are thinking about this and thinking about how they want to present themselves. So I just thought I'd leave it at that, but I hope that's given you a good sort of round sort of overview. And yeah, thanks so much again, Piers, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Clara has to say, because you know, net zero sort of buildings and architecture isn't something that I myself actually have a huge amount of background in, so but obviously really fascinated in it, so really looking forward to the discussions, and thanks again.
Thanks, Gwen. Clara is going to talk next.
Sorry, I'm just setting up my presentation. Thank you so much, Gwen. Hopefully you can see my screen okay now.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to give a bit of a deeper dive into Architects Declare and what we've been doing over the last year. And then I'm going to focus on kind of what this means for buildings moving forward and give a bit more of a kind of practical side to it. So I'm sure you're all aware of the Architects Declare signatory points, but in case you're not, I thought I'd run through them briefly. So the practices have signed up to the following 11 points. Well, I'm just going to highlight a few of them, but they're all about raising awareness, advocating for faster change, establishing climate and biodiversity mitigation principles, sharing knowledge, a key one here, evaluating all new projects against how do they contribute positively or negatively, upgrading existing buildings, including whole life carbon modelling, post-occupancy evaluation as part of basic scopes, adopting more regenerative design principles in our studios, and collaborating with engineers and contractors, and accelerating the shift to using low body carbon materials. So that's just a few of them, and I'm sure you're aware of them, but these are the points that we're going to be always going back to when we focus on what Architects Declare have been doing. So our vision is a transformed built environment, planned, constructed and operated within planetary boundaries, delivering positive social impact for all. Which I think is quite, you know, I read that and I think, wow, like that is the future, and that's what we're all working towards, which is really, really fantastic. And as Peter explained, Architects Declare has grown and become Constructions Declare, and this is a global movement with over 5,000 signatories across 23 countries, and it's a real multidisciplinary collaboration now, and it's a really exciting thing to be part of it, and something I'm really proud that I've been invited to be part of the steering group. So as well as growing to a global movement and being multidisciplinary, the focus this year has been all about shifting mindsets. It's about sharing knowledge, it's about collaborating across all the different Declare movement groups, but also collaborating with other groups in the industry that have a similar mindset and a similar vision. For me, the key thing which excites me about Architects Declare is the fact that once you've signed up to this as a practice, you really always, it gives you something, you know, you can look at yourself in the mirror and you really have to make sure that you're aligned with those commitments. You know, we've seen, but in the media, that any practice that signs up to Architects Declare will be held to account, and that's really great, because I think you'll be held to account in the media, you're held to account within your own practice, and also personally within your own soul. Are you doing everything you can to meet those declaration points? So that's really key. We've done a survey for our signatories, and we asked them a few questions, and I thought it would be useful to go through a few of them now. Over 60% of signatories said that they felt that their practice and their approach has changed since becoming a signatory, which is really great. And here are a few obstacles to making change, and I wanted to pull out the key ones which received the most votes. So time and resourcing, and knowledge level, and clients, which is interesting, and that really helps us focus as AD, as LETI, as CD, as all these groups. What are we focusing on? And one of them is clients, and we really need to work out how we can support clients and developers make the right choices, set the right briefs, have the right understanding of what they need to do to deliver a building that doesn't become a stranded asset. So that's our takeaway from that, is that a real focus is on engaging developers and clients. Knowledge level is an interesting one. We really need to keep sharing resources, keep publishing guidance, and pointing people towards useful guides, be it on embodied carbon or operational carbon or post-occupancy. And time and resourcing, I think it's about how do we shift up the resourcing within our practice to make sure that people are given enough time to make the radical changes that are needed. And yeah, there is still much more to be done. And we asked for every of the declaration points, the practices, to ask, are they implementing it, or are they not implementing it? It's a bit small, so you won't be able to read it, but I wanted to kind of highlight one of them, which scored the worst, I would say, is this: including whole life carbon modelling and post-occupancy evaluation as part of a basic scope and basic brief. Now that's really interesting, and I'll talk about that a bit more in detail later on. So what does this all mean for buildings, right? We've signed up to the declaration, and all the points kind of seem really valuable and really useful, but what does this mean for buildings? So this is a diagram from the International Living Future Institute, and it's all about pulling our buildings from creating, from being bad, from negative environmental impacts, to creating positive environmental impacts. If you're not aware of the Living Building Challenge certification, do have a Google. It's probably, I'd say, the most robust certification scheme globally for sustainable buildings. And I think this really resonated with me. It's a diagram that I saw about 5 years ago, and it really helped me work out where I want to go, what I want to be doing. And it's, with building regulations, we always talk about percentage less bad, and we need to start be thinking about actually what good things are my building delivering. So ideally, we jump from the left to the right, and we'd be delivering buildings that are positive environmentally and socially. Although we do need to take some steps in that direction. Gwen was talking about net zero carbon, so bringing it back to that. That is an intermediary step, the bit where the graph crosses. So how do we get to net zero carbon with our industry? And this is where I put a little bit of my LETI hat on rather than my AD hat. So LETI have been collaborating across the industry to work out how you define a building that is net zero carbon in terms of its operational energy. I won't go through it in lots of detail, but I think it's important to work out, or to show that there's a balance here. Your operational energy, so your heating, your hot water, your lighting, your ventilation, all of that needs to be balanced with renewable energy, be that on-site or off-site. So that's pretty clear, right? If you're achieving your balance, you're net zero carbon. Fantastic. The problem is we have a finite amount of renewable resources in the UK. So if you take up more than your fair share, you're stopping somebody else be zero carbon, and that's not what we want. We need equitable zero carbon in the country. So this is why part of the zero carbon definition is to have an energy budget, right? So you need to, if you're using that amount of energy, amount of renewable energy, and if all other buildings use that, then we'll be meeting our zero carbon target, because we'll all be using our renewable budget. So that's our EUI, point 1 of the one page here. I'm not going to go through the rest, but it's something we can go into in more detail, or you can download at the LETI website. So it's not all about operational carbon, it's also about embodied carbon, and together that makes whole life carbon, which was that declaration point that some people were having trouble with. So embodied carbon is the carbon emissions associated with digging up your raw materials, transporting them to the factory, making your products, transporting them to the construction site, constructing your building, maintaining your building, deconstructing your building, and disposal. And you need to think about it in a very different way to operational carbon, because it's actually there. It's in your walls behind you. It's in your floor. It's in your table that you're hopefully sitting at, or maybe you're sitting by your sofa, hopefully not at your desk. But yeah, it's everywhere, and so it's there. We need to keep it, and it's all about circular economy and reusing rather than using virgin material. So a different approach is needed, and we've created with Letty, we've created some guidance to help the declaration be implemented with the kind of operational stages, and also the embodied carbon primer, which looks at your how you reduce the embodied carbon of materials and how you look about circular economy. So I wanted to finish with what this means, what whole life carbon means, whole life zero carbon. So let's just take the graph to the left. We've got some bar charts, and the first bar chart really shows how buildings are performing today in terms of whole life carbon. The pink is the embodied, the yellow is the operational, and that's a standard building that meets building regulations. Now, if we shift the operational energy to be within the renewable budget that I was talking about, you look at the third bar, so that really massively changes it. But you need to consider, and you can see that when you get to that point, when you're meeting your ultra low energy targets, a massive amount of carbon is in the embodied carbon, over 80%. And so that's when you really need to start reducing your embodied carbon. So our trajectory is to reduce our embodied carbon. We've got some embodied carbon targets for 2020, 2030, but still, what does this mean for whole life carbon? And that's whole life net zero carbon. That's something the industry is grappling with at the moment. So if you're interested in getting involved in these discussions, please do tell me. My understanding at the moment of what whole life net zero would be is a building that's 100% made of reused components and can be 100% disassembled and made into other buildings, as well as achieving the operational energy balance. So I guess that's kind of putting the declaration points a bit into what that could mean for your projects. I wanted to end on this example. It's a residential development in Seattle. Now, it was a project that I visited about 3 or 4 years ago now, and I guess I wanted to highlight that it's not about the carbon numbers. Sometimes it's not all about those detail. It's also about how the building can inspire residents to have a different lifestyle. So this is 100% net zero energy building, but also it captures rainwater that's used to flush the toilets in the development. And now, for parts of the year when it's a drought, the rainwater tank gets empty, right? So you can't flush your loo, and someone from the development has to go and has to actually turn on the mains tap to fill up that tank, which means that they can flush their loos. And normally that will be automatic. In all buildings I've ever seen, apart from this one, it's always automatic. But actually, because the resident has to actually go and do that, it means that they're in sync with the environment. They understand that they're in a drought, so they might use less water or take other actions. But I think what's really key when we design buildings is to really think about the little things we can do to help connect us with nature, connect us with the environment. So that's where I want to leave it. And I think I'm now handing over to Peter.
Great, thanks very much. I don't have any slides. I just wanted to kind of put forward some propositional thoughts to lead into the discussion, really. And to tell you what I think the most difficult issues are that we have to deal with to get to the world that Clara has just described. And it's one of the things to start with is obviously the existing building stock, and it is the great sort of elephant in the room, I think, whenever architects get together and talk about low carbon buildings, because we always tend to talk about new buildings. And very rare, and if we're talking about renovation of existing buildings, it tends to be buildings that we know and love and are dealing with in a very sympathetically architectural way. What no one is doing really is actually looking at the huge existing housing stock in particular, and figuring out ways in which we've got to go through that in a very kind of ordered way in order to meet zero carbon by 2050. The people that I think are probably ahead of the game is the Welsh government, who have a kind of set out a target. For the first 10 years, they will be looking at all social housing in Wales. and in doing so, we'll generate an industry that is capable of actually undertaking that sort of work. Because the last time this was discussed was actually shortly after the last crisis, with the new Green Deal, which actually fell flat on its face and didn't work because there wasn't enough money and there wasn't enough management of the process to make it work. So I'm afraid, Gwen's mentioned the Rishi Sunak's statements as of yesterday. I'm afraid I'm skeptical as to whether we can actually move fast enough with that recovery, the green recovery plan applied to existing housing. It is a very difficult thing to do. I think the government is failing to welcome into that discussion city governments and city planners who are probably the best positioned people in order to start that green retrofit process. So I think let's dwell on that and really focus on it rather than on new buildings. The second issue, which is to do with embodied carbon, and as Clara mentioned, it is becoming the major issue, more of an issue than operational carbon emissions, simply because we've gone through a process of, well, we have learnt to produce better performing buildings, but we're also producing our electricity is from renewable sources these days, so we're cutting the carbon emissions from the grid. But that leaves us with the really difficult issues of embodied energy, and I have no idea how we're going to deal with the problem of concrete. I have seen over the last 40, 50 years all kinds of exciting ideas about how you can reduce embodied carbon in concrete, and nothing has really we all know about GBS, we all know about PFA, etc., but they haven't made really a major sea change in the way we look at the proportion of the embodied carbon costs that goes into substructure and superstructure. Allied to that, we also have the real danger, if we're not careful, that structural timber may no longer be allowable within our buildings if the government policies, or if suggested government policies, go ahead, and that would be totally disastrous because it's a way of building in sequestered carbon into our buildings. The third issue I just wanted to raise was broadening the scope a little bit and talking about biodiversity and thinking about where and how we're going to plant the 30,000 trees a year that we need to plant in order to meet government targets. And let's not forget that we're dealing with the overall environment, not just the built environment, and that the countryside needs as much attention as the cities quite often. And fourthly, let's not also forget that 30% of our emissions in this country to do with transportation, that we have to move faster towards a lower energy transportation system, and that means really looking at the way our cities are performing in terms of making them cycle and pedestrian friendly, and really investing in low carbon transportation. And finally, as both previous speakers have mentioned, I think this post-COVID era is going to be really important for us to seize the opportunity. Everybody is suggesting that it is a once in a generational opportunity to make a real difference to our urban world, particularly. We have to start thinking about creating greener cities that people can enjoy, and we have to really focus on what are we going to do with a lot of our commercial spaces and possibly retail spaces that aren't going to be occupied as they were previously. So I think it's a really interesting series of challenges that at the moment we've seen 17-18% reduction in carbon emissions during this crisis, and we mustn't let that opportunity slide away from us. So I look forward to a debate and some questions. Piers.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so there are a couple of questions which I will come to in a second, but I think some super interesting things that I hope will provoke quite a lot of debate, which is that, the first issue, of course, is that most of the building stock that we need for 2050 has been built. And that is, of course, a big problem. I think the second issue, in a way, is this issue of density in city centres. And forgive me if I get this wrong, but I think this statistic is right, that there are two cities, they have the same populations, Atlanta and Barcelona. Atlanta is Atlanta is 10 times the surface area in terms of the amount of land it takes up compared to Barcelona. Barcelona, and they have the same climate, has 1/10 of the CO2 emissions. So it's an extraordinary thing that density does in terms of bringing our emissions down. And so that's something just to bear in mind in all of this. The other thing, I guess, is that it doesn't sound like there is a single significant zero carbon building. And it is unbelievably hard. And I think for too long we focused on zero energy, whereas the much more interesting shift has been to this question of zero carbon. I'm not expecting anyone to answer that now. I'm going to come to some questions. And Guida Veneri would like everyone, but I think specifically Clara, to talk a little bit more about the Living Building Challenge. Could you do that, Clara?
Sure. It's a certification scheme for buildings, and it's run by the ILFI, International Living Future Institute, out of Seattle. Now, what's really great about this rating scheme is it's actually all about in-use performance, and you can, and it's also it's kind of rounded, so it talks about social justice values as well. It talks about equity, and it really, I mean, these buildings that are fully, so you can be PETAL certified. There are various PETALs: energy, water, waste, social justice, and you can be PETAL certified, or you can be totally Living Building Challenge certified. These buildings have to have 100% habitat exchange. They're net zero energy in terms of their embodied carbon. They have low embodied carbon and offset. So they've really got the full package. The Bullitt Center is an office building that meets this in Seattle, and it's a really fantastic example. Interesting architecture. Some like it, some hate it. So I would recommend that you go onto their website and have a look at some of their case studies. There is one Living Building Challenge certified centre up in Lancashire. It's a visitor centre, which I haven't managed to go and have a look at because I really wanted to go, plan to visit this year, but obviously we haven't gone there yet. But that's a really good example of Living Building Challenge.
Brilliant. Thanks, Clara. Next, Simone has a question, which is, I think, a really topical one, which shows how unjoined up all of our thinking is in terms of how individually and collectively we can deal with this issue of climate change. And her question is that she's running for an RIBA council seat this year and wants to ask how the RIBA can work closer with Architects Declare to provide a broader platform for real action.
Yes.
Who wants to answer that?
Shall I have a go to start with? I think we are working very closely. I think that the interesting thing is that the RIBA, about 6 months after our declaration, came up with the 2030 challenge, which interestingly is very similar in terms of the targets that it sets to the Letty guide that Clara was talking about. We have now, as a practice, we've taken on board those targets. It looks at targets for operational energy and an embodied carbon, and looks at current day targets, and then 2022, 25, and 2030, and looks at targets for residential and non-residential buildings. It's a fairly, and water supply, in fact. It's a fairly crude guide at the moment because typologically you only have residential versus non-residential. But it is becoming, I think, an accepted set of targets for us to talk to clients about. I think it's a sound piece of work done by the Sustainable Futures Group at the RIBA. And we look forward to working more closely with the RIBA. I think it's true to say that would not have come out as fast as it did as a document if it hadn't been for the declaration, as well as the Letty Guide and the Extinction Rebellion, and the general, much more involvement in the issues that the RIBA saw and reacted very quickly and came up with their own guidelines. And I think what we're seeing is those professional guidelines, I think, will hopefully become mandatory guidelines if the government then gets its act together and follows suit.
Great, thanks, Peter. Next, we have a question from Amrita, which is again a very interesting one in the context of knowing that 55% of people who have signed up to Architects Declare have struggled with convincing their clients to commit to zero carbon. And I mean, also, well, a question is, can you share resources for project architects seeking to convince clients to commit to zero carbon? But actually, and those specifically ones that speak on the client's terms, financial policy, etc. I have a slightly wider question, which is one I also might ask Gwen. Is this, why is it still why is it taking so long to legislate? What are the timescales for some of these things? So who would like to answer Amrita's question initially about how to convince clients?
You didn't pronounce my name right.
I think it's really, I can. Do you want me to answer now or after Gwen?
Why don't you go first and then Gwen?
Okay. I think convincing clients, yeah, I mean, it's key, and I think it's making sure that we're talking their language. It's talking about making sure that projects aren't a stranded asset. We do life cycle, a whole life costing when we look at projects, and really try and factor in things like the cost of retrofit. So, for instance, if we know we need to meet this target, and if you're not meeting it now, if your buildings aren't zero carbon now, it's going to cost 5 times more to retrofit it to that standard than if you build to that standard from the beginning. So Letty are creating a client guide at the moment this year that was due to be published in autumn, which will talk to all those points. So I don't have any references to give you them now, but they are coming.
Great, thanks, Clara. Gwen, can you talk about timescale?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd like to sort of also pick up on something that Peter mentioned about really the big carbon emitters is the homes that we already have, and they're sort of leaking energy and heat and bad for people's health. And so there is that, you know, those are really the targets that need to be done, but it's you know, it's politically difficult for the government, much more so than decarbonising the power sector, where you can get rid of coal-fired power stations. You know, this is actually going into people's homes. This is actually insulating their roofs. This is a sort of a political decision that needs to be done in a way that isn't going to lose them votes if it's done badly. So, you know, Peter already mentioned the sort of Green Deal and how badly that went down. So there's a lot of polling going on at the moment, and a lot of interesting research in terms of people's attitudes towards home insulation, this kind of thing, because it also impacts all of us. You know, I'm living in a house at the moment which would need to be upgraded to EPC band C, so you know it impacts me as well, and the importance that this needs to be done well, and create a really good skilled workforce who are able to do this well, and that we don't end up with cowboys doing this, which end up making it go backwards. I organised a couple of citizens' juries on climate change last year, and that was all about trying to understand sort of the mindset of different voters in different constituencies about environmental and climate policies, and badly done home insulation was something that they were a bit concerned about, but they could also see the benefits in terms of warmer homes and that kind of thing. So I think it's just that the government have been putting it off for too long, but I think now we're at a point where they know that they need to do this, both in terms of carbon emissions, but also because it's a good employer. It creates a lot of jobs at a time when we've got the coronavirus economic crisis. You can inject all that money into the economy by boosting this sector. So I think there's a few different reasons there.
Great, thanks, Gwen. I think it's interesting to hear that the problem with existing homes. I'm going to caveat that and say something that perhaps people don't want to hear, which is that if you build a supposedly zero energy home in open countryside and drive 10,000 miles a year in a family hatchback to work, and you have Amazon deliveries and things being, delivered to your house, you will consume more energy than if you live in a city centre in a leaky air-conditioned apartment. So that's a simple statement of fact again. I'm going to answer one question and just prime a few people. There's a question from Jacqueline, who is involved with the Architecture Foundation, who wants everybody who is here who hasn't signed up to AD to talk a little bit about why you have made a decision not to sign the declaration, particularly if your aims are aligned to those of AD. So if some of you can start thinking about that. But meanwhile, Stuart McAllister has raised a very good point that case studies are a fantastic way to communicate complex issues. And are there any good compendiums of case studies related to ways which we can reduce embodied carbon? Might be one for you, Peter.
Yes, or Clara, who's probably, because there are case studies in the carbon section of the Letty guide. I think the interesting thing is that we need more of those case studies. We have contributed over the years quite a few of our projects to the what was called the Carbon Buzz website. And unfortunately, that's no longer kind of up and running. But there's a whole load of data of buildings, particularly from an operational, not an embodied perspective, I have to say, where people fed data to a UCL-based database for comparative purposes, and unfortunately, it's died a death. It's not, you can't get access to it anymore. But the data is there, and we're trying to revive it with UCL and update it and include also embodied carbon in the calculations. The real problem is that we have very few buildings which are built where embodied carbon has been carefully and fully measured, and we are only just learning the process of what the values are. The EPD values and the ICE database that provides embodied carbon are all still being questioned by architects and engineers, and the data isn't really perfect yet, and it's always going to be changing. But I think maybe I'll hand over to Clara, because she could talk more about the case studies within the Letty guide.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. So Letty published in January the embodied carbon primer. I just sent a link to chat group, and that does have a few case studies in it about specifically. So we've got in the appendix of the embodied carbon primer, it's that there's a section that talks about different parts of the building, and then we're showing some case studies specifically for those sections, what people have done to reduce embodied carbon. But I feel like I might be a bit of a broken record, but this year Letty are collecting specifically case studies on embodied carbon. So Rahila, she works at Hawkins Brown, she's leading that subsection of the embodied carbon group for Letty, and will be trying to compile case studies in a comparative way, right? So what's really key with embodied carbon is there are standards, there are EN standards out there, there are different tools, and at the moment, as Peter said, if you're using different tools, you might get different results. And so actually, it's quite hard to compare apples to apples and to make kind of rules of thumb guidance on what's good and what's bad and what you need to focus on, because the methodologies are slightly different. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to establish a way of providing information case studies with all the information so that you can actually compare them like for like. So that work is going on with the Letty embodied carbon group, specifically the strand that Rahila is running, but also with the Whole Life Carbon Network, the group that's run by Simon Hedges.
Can I just come back and say one? Can I just come back and say one other thing, Piers? That on the AD website, you will be able to find the videos of about 10 different talks belonging to a workshop that we ran about 9 months ago, which are all on the subject of embodied carbon. Clara gave one, people talked about timber, people talked about comparing structural systems, etc. And as a kind of general introduction to embodied carbon, that might be useful.
Great, thanks, Peter. Simon Kahn has a question, probably one for you again, Peter, which is about stone. He saw a recent webinar organized by you on materials. He was amazed by Steve Webb's talk on stone. Is stone the future?
Stone is an amazing low embodied carbon material because you just dig it out of the ground and use it. The idea that you could crush it up, you should crush it up and then burn it with calcium and create something that we call concrete is a bit absurd, really. Stone is a fantastic material, and local stone in particular it comes out as very low embodied carbon.
We're using stone piled foundations, rammed, crushed stone as foundations at the moment, which is a really interesting thing for us to be doing. ACAN, this is a question from Tabitha Binding from Trada. ACAN have a climate literacy workshop for tutors on the 22nd of June to look at knowledge and teaching within schools of architecture. On average, 5,000 Part 1 students graduate every year with little or no technical knowledge. Is this an opportunity to grab? And also, I'm going to add in, why do we teach Part 1 students so little about environmental design?
I mean, I feel like that's not really a question. It was a statement. It was talking about what the great stuff that ACAN's doing. So obviously, yeah, I mean, everyone who's a tutor should be going along to that workshop that ACAN are organising. I think I was lucky, although I'm an engineer, I did study Part 1 architecture, and I was lucky enough to go to a Nottingham course, and in Nottingham they do teach climate literacy. So that's put me on the path that I am on today. But I am well aware that RIBA are changing its criteria for courses that are RIBA certified, and it will have a host more kind of bits in there relating to literacy. So I'm really hoping that will change very shortly.
Can I just add? I think the whole nature of architectural education is changing as a result of students making their voices heard, and which is wholly positive. You know, it's like the great thing about the climate movement at the moment is that it is led by the younger generation. And I teach at Bath University, and I know that they just last year they devoted several days of student-run debates on embodied carbon and the climate emergency. And I think, you know, let's just let the students take over, and it will all get better.
Okay. Is there anyone here that specifically would like to ask or suggest what else AD could do to promote this idea that we do need to react with increasing urgency and commitment, and also tell us why, if you haven't signed up, what would make you sign up? Anyone want to say anything about that? Or Benito Blanca wants to ask, how could AD push knowledge and skills and training? How could push knowledge and skills and training than after client and time resources? Sorry, I don't quite understand your question. Benito, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Benito Blanca? Great.
You hear me?
Yeah, great.
No, I think that in the obstacle slide that it was identified in the surveys, after the client and the time and resource, there was this idea about knowledge and times, about how to increase the knowledge and the skills in order to face the challenge that we are, as a profession, we are doing. And I was wondering whether through Architect Declare we can tackle that. No, how can we increase the knowledge within our practices and within the profession in general?
Shall I have a go at that? I mean, I think, you know, the embodied carbon workshop that we ran in London, I think it was a huge success. It was oversubscribed twice, you know, and it was just getting people together with really high quality knowledge of a subject that people don't know much about. I think we would like, through Architects Declare, through maybe Construction Declares, organise similar events regionally. We had Clara and I spoke in the Southwest to a group organised by Southwest RIBA, and a mixture of architects, engineers, and contractors, etc. And I think there is an opportunity for us to offer the knowledge that within not so much within the steering group of Architects Declare, but within the wider signatories of the declaration, we could actually look at ways in which we could offer that on a regional basis. And it's something that we're looking at generally as AD, to set up regional groups run locally, perhaps with both architects and engineers together, to actually overcome some of the deficiencies of knowledge that you were referring to, and setting ourselves up really as a sort of self-help group, on a regional basis.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, Clara.
And I would say I think it's about kind of really grabbing it yourself, within the architecture practices. It's working out where you're at, what you need to know. As an individual, do you know what you need to do to make your building, your project that you're working on, a building that there is regenerative, a building that meets our climate emergency? And if you don't, work out how ask questions, talk about it with your colleagues, talk about it in wider discussions with industry. When I started Leti 3 years ago, I didn't know any of the answers. It was just that I was saying, hey, I think this looks wrong and I want to do something, and who's there that can do things. So it's all about collaboration and communication. And I think, it is good to listen to talks and read books and things, but I think a questioning mind and really trying to find what you really care about and really go for it, and write Twitter articles and LinkedIn articles and find other people that are interested in it. I think that's how you really build knowledge, and you really jump between kind of making change in a significant way.
Okay, fantastic. So I think we're close to 6:30. So I think I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to have make one last point, which builds on this last point, which is I think the danger for architects is thinking that all of this is the technical fix. And I think what COVID has shown us is that, how much lifestyle can do. So overnight, we start saving 30% of or start reducing our CO2 emissions by 30%. And the thing that we don't talk about enough is this idea of resilient buildings. And if you look at my local town and most people's local town, the existing building stock up to probably about 50 years ago were buildings that were incredibly versatile. So my local town, they have buildings that can be used for hospitals, for schools, for offices, for houses, for flats, big houses, small houses, all manner of different things. And at the same time, those same buildings had an obligation beyond themselves, beyond their physical fact, to make a piece of public realm. And the sort of joined up thinking in the built environment, for me, is the most interesting and important thing that we can do. And to think this is one thing, to think it's either a technical fix or a bolt-on solution or a specific zero energy building is, I think, a big problem. As a last and final point, could the three of you who are speaking talk a little bit about the joined up thinking that all of us need to do within the built environment specifically? Gwen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Because I think actually I was thinking about Clara's presentation and the sort of Seattle development, and it made me think about the UK a little bit, and the fact that the government have said that they're sort of relaxing planning, and how is that going to go? Are we going to, they've also said that they're going to do more roads. So it's like, we do really need to be joined up on this, and I think it's amazing to see Architects Declares, and I feel like I've learnt so much just from joining this evening, and I know that there's so much more to do, from linking up the environment sector and the likes of architecture. So I think it's fantastic that this initiative has happened, and I think there's lots more to do, and I'm excited to be involved.
Great, thanks, Gwen. Clara, you need to unmute yourself if you want to say a final point on this joined up thinking.
I feel, but that just because of the networks that I'm in, I feel like we've been collaborating within the design team quite well. over the last few years, and I think we need to collaborate and bring in the developers into the discussion more and really understand what they're coming from, what their points of views are, how we get them, how can we help them make the decisions we think they should make, or understand why they're not, and really start to tackle that. And then that one layer up is involve investors. So how can we collaborate with investors so that they invest in the buildings that we think are meeting the right targets? So I'd say it's a shift to developers and investors.
Great, thanks, Clara. Peter, final point?
Well, just following on from that, I mean, we didn't initiate it, but it's very interesting that the Better Buildings Partnership, which is actually a consortium of about 30 of the major developers and asset managers that own London, practically. You know, there's 300 billion pounds worth of assets there that they own, and they have made their own declaration, and it actually it commits them to declaring the carbon content of those buildings and how they're going to upgrade them towards zero carbon. So it's actually a very interesting declaration that they have made, and I think they are the top of the food chain, and it's very interesting if they have shifted. And I think we're also now, we've now got the contractors on board as part of construction declares. And if they're coming in from the other end, if you like, that's all the major contractors. I think we're beginning to have a consortium of people within the built environment that actually have a huge kind of weight. And if you look at what's happening globally, I think that there's a change in the kind of metric. I think what we are really trying to do, as we said right at the beginning, is shift the paradigm. Is actually keep the climate crisis in focus, and we welcome the debates like this, and we welcome the debates that are in the press at the moment, you know, about are certain architects following their declaration or not. I mean, you know, none of us is whiter than white. We all have our difficult clients and difficult economic and ecological issues to deal with. But I think let's, you know, make sure that we keep the climate and biodiversity crises at the center of the debate within the construction industry as a whole, from the investor through to the contractor. And we are in a focal point as architects in the middle to actually ensure that debate remains very vital.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you, Architecture Foundation, Ellis and Rosie, for organising the 100-Day Studio and having us here. Thanks so much, speakers Gwen, Clara and Peter. And thank you all for coming. And this will be on YouTube very soon.